and then ask the question.
So you're not recording this. This is going to be live.
This is live, both. Yes.
Okay, Mahfuz.
Okay.
And we'll go for about an hour or so or something.
As much time as you have. Half hour.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Okay.
Okay. Welcome to another episode of Channeling Jewish History. I'm here with Professor David Ruderman, who is a professor of Jewish history at the University of Pennsylvania, Joseph Meyerhoff Professor of Modern Jewish History, to be exact, at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the author of numerous books on Jewish history. First of all, warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you very much.
Okay, his latest book, your latest book, I should say, is called Missionaries, Converts, and Rabbis, the Evangelical Alexander Mccall and Jewish-Christian Debate in the 19th Century. It covers a lot of people and events. I think each of the people that you mentioned in the book you can probably write a book on each of them individually. Am I correct? And it's so complex and interesting. Let's start off in order and talk about a little bit about Alexander Mccall. So Alexander Mccall is an interesting guy. He's an evangelical Christian. He's a Protestant evangelical Christian. And he wrote this massive tome called Nativot Olam in Hebrew, I understand, right?
He wrote it in English, and it was translated by one of his Mumarim, one of his the converts he influenced, who became his translator, who put it into Hebrew, a very good Hebrew, actually.
Right. So that's the Cheskel Meshumet, or Stanislaus Hogan. Right. So his argument is that it sounds very Martin Lutheran, if I can use that term, especially one of the things that he says. He says, he's saying the Jews, during the persecutions of the Crusades or the Inquisition, it might be excusable for the Jews not to accept Jesus or not to accept Christianity. But in the present time and circumstances, it is indefensible. Who are the heathens and the kingdoms whom the offerers of these perditions wish to be pursued with God's wrath and to be destroyed from under the heavens? Are they the Christians or the heathen idolaters of Africa and India? The Mohammedans profess a faith in the unity very similar to that of the rabbis. They therefore cannot be intended. On and on. Basically saying, I couldn't help but think of, what Martin Luther originally said, that because of the Catholic persecutions of the Jews, who can blame the Jews for not wanting to convert? But now, what's their excuse?
Right.
We're offering a much more loving, accepting version of Christianity.
Right. All right. Can I that's an excellent question, and it's a good way to start. But can I back up with a little bit of background before I jump into that question?
Absolutely.
Is that okay if I take it?
More than okay.
My own way to start? Is that
Sure.
okay with you?
Sure.
All right. So first of all, let me introduce myself. You already introduced me very nicely, but I just want to talk about myself as an historian and why I got into this subject in the first place, and then I will go immediately to Mccall.
Absolutely.
So I'm really an early modernist. An early modernist means a person who studies basically Western European history, or in this case, Jewish history, from roughly the Renaissance until the Enlightenment. So roughly from, to put in Jewish terms, 1492 until, let's say, the end of the 18th century. And all of my books, I've had a 45-year career, beginning with the Renaissance, has moved me up farther and farther. This is a 19th century book, so this is, first of all, totally new to me, a novel, and something that really probably expands me beyond my own capabilities. But, when you get old, you have a lot of chutzpah, you can do anything you want, you don't need to get tenure, you don't have to prove yourself to anybody, so you do what you love, and that's what I was doing here. There are two points of continuity with my earlier work. I'm an intellectual historian. I'm interested in the history of ideas, of Jewish ideas, and their interaction with a larger intellectual context in which Jews live, cultural context in which Jews live. The 2 points of continuity, number one, the history of Jewish-Christian relations, how Christians are affected by the encounter with their Jewish minority. That is the subject of Christian Hebraicism, the study of Christian Hebrew scriptures, the study of Hebrew of rabbis, which becomes very prevalent in the period that we are speaking about, and also the history of Christian study of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism. From the Jewish point of view, to what degree Jews are both resisting and maintaining their own identity, at the same time are absorbing and are culturally transferring, either consciously or unconsciously, elements of the outside society, which then help to shape their own identity as Jews. So that interest has been, a standard interest of mine from the Renaissance on. The other thing that has fascinated me, and maybe it's a little bit autobiographical, I don't know. I always I tell my students that all history has an element of autobiography in it. We don't just study the past, we study the past because it means something for the present. And that is my interest in mingled identities, or to use the term that Natalie Zeman Davis used, the great historian, braided identities. In other words, particularly in the period that I work in, from the 16th, 17th century on, Jews become more and more open in the larger culture, and they are not solely defined either by the church if they are Christians, or by the synagogue and the rabbis by Jews. They are what we might call boundary crossers. They not only negotiate with the outside world, but in some respects, they adopt certain aspects of their own identity which come from the other. This whole perspective goes back to a very famous book by Yisrael Yuval, Shnei Goyim Bevitnech. It is about the history of Jewish-Christian relations, which he argues how Christianity helped to shape everything from the Pesach Seder on in terms of the rabbis. It was a very controversial book when it came out in the 1990s. He's an Israeli historian who just retired from the Hebrew University. But whether he's exaggerating or not, there's no doubt that the Christian element has had a deep impact on Jews. And the period that I work in, what emerges in a very interesting way are Jews who are adopting themselves and even be taking on certain elements of Christianity. In other words, we are clearly talking about boundaries, but boundaries that are often broken. For example, the conversos are an interesting breed of Jews who are originally Christian and return to Judaism. But when they return to Judaism, they don't necessarily give up all of their Christian identity. Or some groups within the followers of Shabtai Tzvi, Shabtaim, or Sabbateans, who also took on, who were quite aware of the world of Islam and Christianity, and took on elements of both. So these mingled identities, which I call also converts who convert to Christianity or convert to Judaism, but nevertheless retain their original identity and sometimes revert to their original identity. It's a very interesting process here. It's also very much part of a modern process whereby Jews live with many identities, not just one. As they step out of their isolated existence and enter into the larger world. And of course, if we bring it up to date, we are speaking about a large Jewish community of intermarriage and the like, assimilation, acculturation, et cetera, et cetera. So perhaps I'm looking at the roots of these kinds of Jews and find them fascinating, not because I want to be a mingled Jew or a mingled identity, but because they are fascinating as historical subjects. How do they function? How do they function as human beings? They kind of somehow defy the standard definition of what is Jewish and what is Christian. So now I'm starting to talk about this 19th century in Mccall. I was always interested in converts in the early modern period, and there is now a whole literature of converts. Originally, converts were considered in Hebrew or Yiddish mishumadim, a very negative word, were considered outside the realm of good Jewish kosher scholarship. Who wants to talk about mishumadim? They deserted the fold. But people like Todd Endelman and a whole group of others have begun to study the convert. and what he calls the radical assimilationists. And they have entered into a discussion of Jewish history. We have a whole literature now on the convert. I did something else. This book emerged out of a footnote from a previous book, and I won't go into the details of that. It's not that interesting. But I came across this guy, Mccall, and I recognized he was a missionary who was born in Ireland, came to England, originally was a scientist, and then decided to study Christianity and Judaism and was ordained. And he became fascinated with the Jew, and particularly with the Jew as a subject of conversion to Christianity. What is interesting about him is that he was sent at the age of 22 after he got married to Warsaw, to Poland. So here is an English missionary sent off to Poland, where he's going to, first of all, learn Yiddish, and he's going to learn Hebrew, and he's going to learn Talmud. He spends almost 10 years there. His family is enormous. He has about 8 or 9 children, and they all learn Hebrew. They speak Hebrew in their house. They correspond in Hebrew. His daughter, who is quite famous because she marries the chief council of the Protestants and makes Aliyah to Jerusalem, tells us that they spoke only Yiddish or Hebrew in the house. So he becomes very infatuated with very literary Jewish culture, and he learns Talmud. In addition to writing this anti-rabbinic book, which I'm going to talk about right now, he wrote other portraits of Jews. And he even suggests that when you get to know these Jews, you see how authentic and serious and how they care about learning and how they have beautiful family values. And he goes on and on to extol these Jews. The only thing that's wrong with them is that they were corrupted by a rabbinate that took too seriously the stringencies, the chumrot of halakha, of Jewish law. But what I'm trying to point out here is that this missionary too is a mingled identity. Is a guy that never converted to Judaism, but as we know, and another context in which to put him, the 19th century is a period of British imperialism. It is the period of the Western world conquering Africa and Asia, etc. In many respects, his going to Warsaw to deal with these untutored populations of Jews was as a kind of cultural imperialist. He felt himself superior. Your question, and I haven't forgotten it, he feels himself superior as a Christian because he's a Protestant, because he's the Protestants. And the Protestants are good Christians, while the Catholics, or the Papists, as they were called in England, are bad Christians. And therefore, he can somehow disassociate himself with suffering which the Jews experienced throughout their long history. And he can see themselves, now I bring to you Christian love, and all I want you to do, I appreciate who you are. You are an extraordinary group, and I identify with you. But at the same time, I want you to give up the yoke of halakha, and I want you to become pure Jews. That means Old Testament Jews. That means Mikra. In other words, he has a deep commitment to Hebrew. He goes back after the 10 years in Warsaw, and he runs this missionary college in the East End of London. And then he is appointed as the first professor, believe it or not, of post-biblical Judaism at King's College in London, right on the Strand. I don't know if you know London well enough to know where that is. It's a great university, very Protestant, very, very Anglican. And I had the great honor 3 years ago of being invited to give my 4 lectures on Alexander Mccall in the same department where he was a professor in the 19th century. And it was really cool. I walked in there, and there were all these Anglican bishops with long, big crosses, and I sat there explaining to them who Mccall was and why he had a Yiddish neshama, despite the fact that he was a missionary. So, and one other thing about him, and then we directly zero on your question. In the last years of his life, he got involved with defending the Bible against biblical criticism. And he kind of gave up his missionary work, and he became totally involved in defending the integrity of Mikra, of the Bible, and arguing that in a kind of creationist way that all of these new biblical discoveries could be reconciled with the biblical text, which is the Word of God. And his critics called him a Judaizer, or called him a Jew. The irony of all of this, because he was such a literalist about the Hebrew Bible. For him, his was that every needs to know Hebrew to understand the original biblical text. So here is an Hebraist. Here is a person who loves Tanakh, who reads Parshanut of the rabbis, who studies rabbinic texts, but at the same time he hates the rabbi. So it's this love-hate relationship, which is very much a core of what I study, the whole history of Jewish-Christian relations. But in this case, the Christian imperialists, what happens, of course, is the conqueror is conquered by the conquered. In other words, every time these missionaries went out to Africa and Asia, they started learning the language of the people that they were trying to convert, and in some respects they became they became appreciative of that culture. So what emerges is a kind of interesting interchange between them. So the more he became involved with missionizing, the more he became attracted to Judaism. And that to me is a fascinating kind of dynamic to study. And then, so to answer your question, clearly, yes, he was a very serious Protestant. Sola Scriptura, only Scripture was the very basis of understanding Christianity, and therefore was also for him the understanding of Judaism. He was also an evangelical, and that's very important too, because he honestly believed in this notion that if Jews convert to Christianity, if a core group converts, and particularly if they make Aliyah, this is also the beginning of what we often call Christian Zionism. The whole evangelical roots of Zionism, why evangelicals today are so involved in Israel. He believed that creating a community of Jews who converted, who found the truth of Jesus Christ in Jerusalem would bring about the second coming of Christ. And therefore he promoted this. He wanted and he was offered the job of being Bishop of Jerusalem. He turned it down because he wanted a former Jew to be the head of this community, and he didn't have those credentials. So what is interesting here is his love of land of Israel. His daughter, as I said, and her husband, James Finn, go to live in Israel and become directly involved in his work. And at the same time, his love of Hebrew, his love of Jewish culture, and yet he is a missionary. And yet, how can you call him, in any sense, a person with Jewish identity? He obviously, from the point of view of the world that we live in today, or the world we lived in the 19th century, missionaries are bad for the Jewish people, and understandably so. But here, again, the complexity, the anomaly of this missionary, both loving and hating Jews simultaneously, is what I find fascinating as an historian. So I know I talked too much, but I kind of set it up, hopefully.
Loved it. I really, really enjoyed that. I think that was a great setup. By the way, for those who just joined us, we're talking to Professor David Ruderman of the University of Pennsylvania about his latest book called Missionaries, Converts, and Rabbis. It is about the evangelical Alexander Mccall and the Jewish-Christian debate in the 19th century. Now, thank you so much for giving us a really succinct overview of Alexander Mccall and we didn't yet mention the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity among the Jews, in which he was very instrumental, and the eventual sort of falling out that his family had with the London Society. He himself seemed to have that. But that was an extremely influential organization in the 19th century, in the sense that it was probably the largest and most well-funded organization for the sole purpose of converting Jews to the Christian faith. Is that correct?
Yes. And in fact, that's an irony. When you think of the 19th century, you think of emancipation, you think of secularization, you think of the beginning of modern Jewish culture, and so on. And yet, ironically, the largest missionary organization ever founded emerges in the 19th century with the support of the English crown, with the support of a lot of rich Englishmen and others who support this organization. We have in Germany a similar development of German pietism and missionary activity as well, but England clearly has the largest organization, which is well funded. And their major focus, at least initially, are the thousands of Jews who live in London, most of them who are poor. This organization tries to support them with food and with all kinds of blandishments to bring them into the Jewish fold. And while they are ultimately not successful, and certainly not for ideological reasons, they do win some prizes, and a couple of them are in my book in terms of outstanding Jews that they did convert. But they spread out throughout the entire European world into the Middle East. The missionaries, this is the largest missionary organization. There are other Christian missionaries as well, and go all, as we said, to Eastern Europe. So they are a vast organization, publishing many journals, publishing many books, and training missionaries in their missionary college in London, where Mccall, for a long period of time, was the headmaster, so to speak. And most of these individuals who went out as missionaries were, in fact, former Jews. In other words, the success, they did not succeed in large numbers, but they succeeded in attracting a group of these people, whether they were sincere or not, becoming missionaries and going out to try to convert other Jews. They did not, of course, succeed, but they were a pain in the neck to Jews living in England and elsewhere. They, in fact, if you read the Jewish press in Europe, in France, in Germany, and in particularly the Jewish Chronicle in England, you will see to what degree the issue of missionaries is a thorn in the back of Jews, and they are writing about them and trying somehow to combat them and so on. In the case of Mccall, when he came back from England, he decided to write a series of articles which he published each weekly, which became The Ways of the World, which was eventually published as a book in 1837. It was this critique of Rabbinic Judaism. It was a extremely learned, from the point of view of a Christian, study of rabbinic texts to undermine essentially rabbis and halakha, and to argue that indeed all of these additions by the rabbis were falsifying, were sending Judaism in the wrong direction. And as I said, he brought back, or I didn't say directly, he brought back several converts with him from Poland, one in particular who took the name Stanislaw Hoga, who in 1839 translated the book into Hebrew. The book was then translated into German, French, at least 15 other languages, Judeo-Persian, Yiddish, of course, and it spread like wildfire. Since they had unlimited funds, thousands of these books were produced and were sent all over Europe, and particularly made their way into Eastern Europe. Now, what is interesting here is that who could write a response to Nitivot Olam, as it was called in Hebrew? It was written in a very good rabbinic idiom by a former Jew who was himself a Chassid. Stanislaw Hoga came from the seer of Lublin family. He was a Chassid who left his wife and children and found a non-Jewish wife and came. But then it turns out after a number of years, a very interesting story again. Notice the mingle identities aspect. He wants to return to Judaism, or he believes that he still should be a halachic Jew, even if he does believe in Jesus. And he can't stand the fact that these missionaries are coercing Jews. So after a while, he separates himself from Mccall and from the London Society in the first place. But what happens, was very interesting, is that Moses Montefiore, who is the richest Jew in London, is aware of this threat of this book and how it is being published and republished throughout Europe. And he looks around in London for a Jew who can respond, and he can't find one. So he goes off to Eastern Europe looking for a Jew who is a Yodea Sefer, who can respond page by page to Mccall's attack on the rabbis. And here is another irony of the book. Traditional Jews, whether they're Hasidim or Mitnagdim, are not interested in replying to missionaries. They just say it's treif in the first place, and that's it. Who does he find? He finds several maskilim. A maskil, as you know, is a individual who became involved in a pedagogic, educational, cultural program to make Jews more aware of the larger world, of science, of literature, of culture. The Haskalah, of course, emerges first in Germany in its German version, but when it comes to Eastern Europe, it is primarily a Hebrew phenomenon. And two of the greatest maskilim of Eastern Europe, one is called the Ribal, Isaac Ber Levinson, and the other is called Samuel Isaac Fien of Vilna. They are not small figures. Levinson was called the Moses Mendelssohn of Eastern Europe, or he was called the father of the Eastern European Haskalah. Montefiore approaches these maskilim, and we have actually letters, and he says, do me a favor, write a response. You guys know more than ever. Now, here is the irony. The Haskalah, of course, there are moderate maskilim, there are more radical maskilim, and so on. But the Haskalah, its very nature, argued against traditional Harediyut, argued against traditional Judaism. It argued that Jews need to know more than just Talmud. They need to educate themselves in the world at large. They need to be aware of the rest of the world, and they have to find their place in that larger world. So what emerges among these maskilim were either radical or mild criticisms of the rabbis themselves. The irony here is that now Montefiore comes to these maskilim and he says, you got to write a defense of Judaism. These guys are again ambivalent. On the one hand, they criticize the Talmud. On the other hand, they grew up. They were born in the Talmud. They knew Levinson is such a great Talmudic scholar. It's just overwhelming to see how much he knows and how he puts down Mccall. So on the one hand, they attack. On the other hand, they have to defend. So the irony is that the maskilim now come to the defense of the Talmud and the rabbis. And what emerges are these two moderate maskilim arguing essentially that rabbinic Judaism is a vital and dynamic culture and that it transforms itself over time with a commitment to halakha, but in its changing circumstances. In other words, perhaps I can say here that they not only defend the halakha, but they reconfigure it in an historical way. In other words, they are historicists. They are aware of a time. They are very influenced by a philosopher who lived near them named Nachman Krochmel, who wrote a work called The Guide to the Perplexed of Our Time, Moreh Nevuchei Hazman. They were very aware of history. They read German, they read Polish, they read Russian. These guys were really educated. And they also were learning academic tools to use in the study of rabbinic texts. But they were also lovers of Talmud and rabbinic Judaism. So they come to this with a love of Judaism. So two characters in my book I'm starting to introduce. There are actually 8 characters. And you see, this is a book about Jewish thought. Are Levinson and Fien, who write long Hebrew responses to Mccall, which become popular many years later and which challenge word by word this remarkable missionary. And what we have here then is the revival of the Jewish-Christian debate. But in talking about this missionary, they are forced to define who they are and how they stand vis-a-vis the Talmud and rabbinic Judaism. So, in other words, I see this as a source of their own self-definition, their own attempt to explain who they are as Jews. And that, to me, is, in other words, much of modern Jewish thought is the study of German Judaism, German Jewish thought, from Mendelssohn all the way to Buber and Rosenzweig, etc. Here, I'm looking at Eastern Europe. These guys don't write treatises on theology. but they do know a great deal about Judaism and the outside world. And therefore, seeing them in relationship to this missionary forces them to articulate what they understand about being Jewish. And I found in both cases their Jewish thinking extremely interesting and extremely attractive and worth recovering so that people can appreciate them. But both these two Maskilim have been considered more from a political point of view. They made an affiliation with the Russian government. They were trying to educate Jews, to set up educational institutions and journals and so on. I was again looking at them from the perspective of Jewish thought and how they responded to this guy, Alexander Mccall. So those are 3 of the characters of my book. There are altogether 8. Do you want me to continue to tell you about the rest, or should I wait for the next question?
Let's I'm going to mention a couple other ones.
Okay, go on.
Some figures on the sidelines and some major figures. So I love that you used the term mingle identities, because that comes up a lot in the books. It seems like even the successes that the London Society had were not successes, even though the heart wasn't completely in it. I mean, all of them. Virtually all of them. Margoliouth, Hoga, and all these ones that they could have held up as like their trophies. They all turned on them. Like, they may have stayed Christian, but they certainly didn't have nice things to say about the London Society, and they all sort of reverted back to Judaism in some form. Maybe that's too strong of a word for Margoliouth, but Hoga, and we'll talk about him later because he's a subject in and of itself. Definitely, champions. We'll get to Hoga in just a second. Let me zoom in.
Go on.
Yeah, let me zoom in on one other thing that you mentioned before. So the prevailing attitude of the rabbinic establishment, or I should say the Jewish establishment, was ignore these guys, right? Don't engage in them. Ignore them. And it's so striking because that seems to still be the prevailing attitude. I can't help but, I'm the kind of guy that talks to everyone. I can't forget this one time I engaged a Jews for Jesus guy standing outside Jerusalem Pizza in New York City, and I'm wearing my kippah and I'm speaking to them, and people walk by saying, "Hey, you shouldn't talk to them. You're not supposed to just ignore them. You can't." I said, "Thank you so much for your concern. I got this." It seems this is the prevailing attitude, and it's very understandable. What makes this so interesting is, and I'll mention another person that you devote a chapter to that I want to discuss more. The most fascinating person in the book, as far as I was concerned, and that's Chacham Rabbi Raphael Katzin of Aleppo. And he blasts this approach, and he says this is the reason why this book had such an impact and why Reform Judaism came on the scene, which you say is actually echoes what Mccall himself gave himself credit. He kind of wanted to take credit for the emergence of the Reform movement, although he himself kind of blasts the Reform movement. There's a lot of complexity. Nothing is simple and clear cut, and I love that as well.
That's
where you go.
The theme of the whole book. You got it right there. I hate when people label, this one is Orthodox and this one is Reform and this one is Sephardi and this one's Ashkenazi.
Right.
It's so much more. Life is so much more complicated than all of that. And if a historian can appreciate the complexity, the ambiguity of all these positions, and that's what I say early on in the book. There's no such thing as a Jewish-Christian debate, because there's so many positions here that sort of make it too complex to really draw clear boundaries between one group and the other. But let me say a word about Margoliouth, then I want to talk about Katzin. I love both those characters, and so Margoliouth is another. I'm actually begun to study. I love these Eastern European Jews who migrate. I love intellectual mobility, but I love mobility as a part of Jewish life, and intellectual mobility is even more fascinating. Margoliouth comes from Poland, and he makes his way to England, and he becomes involved with converting, and he becomes a Protestant minister. But he also is a Yodea Sefer. I mean, this guy is extremely knowledgeable and interested in all kinds of Jewish subjects, beginning with biblical scholarship, but rabbinics, Jewish music, all kinds of things, poetry, and he thinks he can make it with his Eastern European accent. I mean, I wish I could have heard him. I can't. I just can imagine. He's sent off to these very far off little shtiebel someplace in the country because he's not taken seriously, and he resents it. And then, fortunately or unfortunately for me, unfortunately for him, through a student of mine, I discovered a whole cache of personal letters that are sitting in the library. I would never have found them. And the letters, which are extremely personal, talks about his divorce from his Jewish wife, and then he plans a trip to Palestine. He goes off to Palestine and he publishes a whole series of letters on his experience in Eretz Yisrael. And boy, is that interesting, because on the one hand, he's going as an Anglican minister. On the other hand, he loves to daven. He loves to sing. He loves to. He's on a boat with a group of Jews, and some woman starts singing from the Haggadah, and he starts joining in with her. And he loves to. He loves meeting Sephardic Jews, especially. And he tells us, and he finds the Aleppo Codex in Damascus. He gets a tour of this extremely rare book, and every time he see, I just. None of my Christian friends can understand because I'm a Yid. It's unbelievable how his identity sort of comes. You can't tell what he is. Of course, he's a Christian. He gets back and he writes a novel in which he attacks the horrible way he is treated as a Christian, and people say the so-called friends of the Jews. How this kind of subtle anti-Semitism is all around him, even when he converted to Christianity, and so he resents it, and he ends up being this totally dissatisfied figure. He can't return fully to Judaism, and he can't accept Christianity, so he remains exactly in the middle. Now, you ask, were most of these these converts? Each one of them deserves their own treatment. Most of the people who converted, and they were, as you said, a small number, converted for economic and social reasons, as Todd Engelman points out in his big book on conversion. The converts of conviction that I'm talking about, some of them actually were converted fully and did quite well. I picked these two guys out because they were so divided, because they reverted to their Jewish identity. Stanislav Hoge and Mark Golio. In other words, that was partly my choice. I found the story fascinating. I said, once a Jew, always a Jew, but to show how you can be so these guys are so complex, and they don't fit in anywhere, and there's a kind of dissatisfaction. But ultimately, and there's also another distinction in Mark Golio's work. He is a cultural Jew, while religiously a Christian. Is that possible in our day and age? We have Jews like that, but already in the 19th century, there is such a phenomenon. He is totally devoted to Wissenschaft, to the study of the academic study of Judaism, and he thought this would propel him to a higher place within the church. But of course, it doesn't, because as I learned after my 50 years in academia, the only people that read books are a few other academic scholars or Meshuggah people like you that do it out of an avocation, not a vocation. Yeah. So that's Mark Golio. Now, so the book, as you see, talks about Mccall. It talks about two of his converts. Both of them end up kind of returning to Judaism in one way or the other. Again, we have to define this loosely. They don't become fully Jews, but they are
unlike what Sid Lyman wrote about Hoga, right? You disagree?
Yeah, well, he didn't, because I traced materials on Hoga that Sid never saw. Right. See, in Hoga's case, it's a little different than Mark Golio. Mark Golio remains a Christian. Hoga maintains that I want to go back and be a halachic Jew. And he writes this. There's no reason why I can't observe the halacha. And he said, that will make Christianity stronger if I observe for me, I have to observe all of the halakha. So I believe in Jesus through the halakha.
Sort of like early Jews for
He's not the
Jesus.
only one.
Right, or Jews for Jesus kind of thing. I guess.
And that's what
Right.
you're absolutely right. In other words, Jews for Jesus is not a new phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's a phenomenon that's been around for a long time.
Hundreds.
And there's a whole movement of Jews in the 19th century who are both Jewish and Christian. Just recently, you might want to interview him. You know Shaul Magid? You know his work?
Yeah. He's great.
So he just published a Soloveitchik,
Yeah.
a relative of the Rabbis,
Yes.
who wrote commentaries
On
on
Matthew.
the New Testament.
Right. He wrote commentary.
He loves to be provocative, and that
Right.
is a very provocative
Yes.
book.
Yes.
But it comes out in the same period that I'm describing now. We spent a lot of time talking about both of our books together. So this is an interesting phenomenon, which, you can say, Magid, of course, has very radical ideas about the contemporary Jewish community. He believes that there should be no boundaries and that Jews and Christians should totally assimilate, et cetera,
Okay.
and we should share our humanity together, et cetera, even though he has an Orthodox micha, I think, or a conservative, I don't know what he has. And he's written a big book on that subject, but his historical work is extremely interesting. He writes on Hasidut. He also talks about the Christian structures of Hasidic thought. The tzaddik being a kind of intermediary, like a priest,
Yes.
between God and man. So, it's all very provocative, and you either like it or you don't. But it's extremely interesting. But let me go back. So I have the two converts. I have Mccall, and I have the two Maskilim. So who's left in the book? I want to talk about. I have a long chapter on two evangelicals who were opposed to Mccall. Both of them extremely interesting. Both of them loving Jews, loving Jewish worship. Both being kind of proto-Zionists. One of them studying Kabbalah. Absolutely fascinating how these people become involved with Judaism in strange ways. But let's just finally talk about Katzin. So there are about 15 responses that I found to Mccall written by Jews. I picked these three out as being the most interesting. Raphael Katzin is as you said, was born in Aleppo. He gets himself into all kinds of interesting power struggles for the rabbinate. Yaron Harel, who teaches at Bar Ilan in Israel, has written a great deal about him. We also have now a new book written by a historian who teaches at Ariel University on the missionaries, Christian missionaries in the Middle East. Katzin is interested in polemicizing both with Islam and with Christianity, but it ends up being more with the Christian missionaries. And he publishes two books. One of them is written in Hebrew. The other is written in Hebrew with a Ladino translation. It is very different. The ambiance is very different. Here is a Jew growing up in a Muslim world. Now, the other part that Harel has now revealed to us is that he disappears after some rabbinic struggles, goes off to Western Europe. We don't know very much about what he learns and what he does, comes back after 5 or 6 years, and opens up a shul, which is a kind of liberal shul. I'm not going to call him a Reform rabbi. That's probably a misnomer. But clearly he attracts a lot of Jews in Aleppo against the chief rabbi of Aleppo. Harel calls him a kind of Reform rabbi. I don't know. I don't know what to make of that. At the same time, his writing is not as learned as the two Maskilim. He doesn't know general sources to that extent. And he talks about Mccall, but then he keeps switching to talking about Christianity in general, because he's facing here a kind of community of Christians against Jews. And his argument is much simpler, but it's beautiful. It's visceral. He talks about the beauty of being Jewish, the beauty of living under halakha, and what that means when Christians don't have these same norms to follow and can't create a kind of life for themselves. At the same time, he seems to appreciate the faith of Christians and the faith of Muslims as well. He has to be very careful because this is highly censored, and I'm sure he couldn't just publish whatever he wanted. He argues there was a larger book, and these books were smaller, compressed versions. But here we go all the way. We have a Jew arguing against Christianity within an Islamic context, and arguing that ultimately the mores of being Jewish, the lifestyle of being Jewish, is on a higher level, and so here is a kind of combination of here's the Sephardic Jew, here's the Jew looking at it through the lens of the Islamic world, but still is this same argument about Christianity. Now, did he read Mccall? He could have read it in Judeo-Persian. He could have read it in Arabic, or he read it in Hebrew probably. But notice all these languages were available, and these missionaries were making inroads even into his world. What a strange world for missionaries to be bumping up against these kind of Jews who are living in a totally different context and now have to face Christianity. So what I'm doing here, B'Kitzur, is trying to create a conversation among all of these people. This is not a history of the London Society. It's not a biography of Mccall per se. It's an attempt to look at the history of Jewish thought and to expand it in all kinds of ways. By looking at Eastern Europe and looking at Aleppo on the one hand, by looking at the revival of a Jewish-Christian debate, which is not exactly the same thing as it was in the Middle Ages or the early modern period, but obviously has a continuity with that past. And to speak about the fact that through the organs of communication, the London Society and its remarkable press, and also the Jews who are not scared any longer to respond. In other words, these Maskilim publish, and they publish strongly, and they argue back and forth. And this remarkable character, Katzin, is not afraid either to step out and to say what he thinks. In other words, the Jew here is also, he's not meek anymore. In the Middle Ages, Jewish-Christian debates were private affairs. They were elite affairs. Through the agency of press and through communication networks, now the Jewish-Christian debate becomes something extremely large. Remember the other important date here. 1839 was the publication of the Hebrew work of Mccall. 1840 was the Damascus Affair. This was a revival of a charge of blood libel against Jews killing a Christian kid in the city of Damascus. What is interesting about that is this is part of a long history that goes right up and through the 20th century of this horrible blood libel, Alilat Dam, during Passover, and so on and so forth. But what is remarkable here, and the great late historian Jonathan Frankel has written an entire book on the subject, through the Western press, through extraordinary history of publications, this Damascus Affair becomes a cause célèbre throughout Western civilization in 1840. And it is covered like no other event in Jewish anti-Semitic history was ever covered. What is ironic here is that Mccall, to show you again this love-hate relationship, published a book in the same year he published his Netivot Olam against the charge of blood libel, bringing together a list of Judeo-Christians. In other words, he and his flock of converts to defend the integrity of Judaism against the blood libel. So here he was defending Judaism at the same time he was attacking the rabbis. So again, the complexity, the anomaly of these sides not being positioned exactly as we would think they would be positioned, and seeing how complex this whole human affair is, and what happens in the 19th century when you take the Jewish-Christian debate and you stick it there. I haven't spoken about his attitude towards Reform Judaism, his attitude towards women, which is an extraordinary subject in the book. The evangelicals are promoting women in their own very strange way. And Mccall spends several chapters arguing against the way rabbis treat women, arguing for the liberation of the Jewish female, and even publishing a translation of a book he finds in Eastern Europe of Tichenes, of prayers written for women and by women in honor of feminine events, shall we say. how does Mccall know about the chinas? He knows. I mean, so again, and he loves it. He loves Jewish women. Because perhaps you could say it's a strategy to convert them, but on the other hand, it's really hard to figure out his position because it's ambivalent.
Right. It seems to have worked, actually. You mentioned in the book, I believe, that more women than men were kind of tied in with the London Society, weren't they?
Exactly. It was their way of doing philanthropy. It was their way of doing, and we have a whole literature which feminist historians have about women. One person who writes about English women in 19th century England, Nadia Ballman, who teaches that Mary was intelligent in London, talks about the fact that the missionaries made Jewish women righteous and naked Jewish men under the influence of the rabbis, as they were. In other words, that the positive image of the Jewish woman who is shackled can be held back by a man, and therefore they influence the women get out of this thing. The other thing, of course, they talk about over and over again is how you treat boys so badly. Where's what you like him as opposed to those bad, the Catholics. And of course they use this, and again, Livingston and Dean and all of them know how to respond, know how to really play the rabbis and how much positive light they deserve, and talk about how high Judaism is saying that you're not unthankful from the Catholic past. That's Christianity too. You can't just say you're a good Christian and they're bad Christians. That's Christianity too. Of course, they say that quite strongly.
Right. I want to continue on a little bit about Casson, and then I want to talk. I want to backtrack to some of the other things we talked about. When I first came across Casson, it was mind blowing. Never heard of him. There are books that are written on the Wars of Aleppo. One was published by ArtScroll about the scholars of Aleppo. I don't know if he's mentioned it. None of this episode is obviously attended to his name. I've come across something online from another Orthodox Society source that says that he got tied up. There was a spell that was cast on him because he became involved in polemics with Christians. Christians cast a spell on him, and he just lived the rest of his life sort of away from the community. It is like hagiography and like rewriting of history. It reminds me like other famous people like the Palestinian son, Moses Snarson, the stories are similar. The bodies say that he got involved. You have to run away because he got involved in polemics with some Christians and things of his life. It's just a fascinating thing, which is a whole separate stuff. Right. It's a fascinating topic. But anyway, about Cassin said that I found one article that was published for the Hebrew Institute. Annual. I read that.
You can see there's a whole footnote. He published his book on controversies of the rabbinate, the Sephardic rabbinate. It came out in English. It was published by Littman, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And there is one full chapter on Cassin there.
And he has more details.
Information is derived from that. And I also talked with him, and we, he shared a lot of this stuff with me, which was really quite fascinating. He's now the dean, I think, of the humanities at Bar-Ilan, or he just stepped down as being dean.
There's no plans of writing a more full-length biography of Cassin, as far as you know.
If I could find more, I would write. First of all, I don't know, the Syrian context, so I was clearly out of my depth even in writing that chapter. But I read the text very carefully. See what he wrote. I mean, it's a full, long chapter. You're right. It was based on an article. I don't know if it was the HUC article or. You'll see there's a long footnote in which I give you all of his writings. I think the chapter on Cassin itself is a Hebrew article, but the book was translated, and he is a prominent person in that book, and therefore you can go on, look on Amazon and find Yaron Har'el and see. I mean, I can pull up the title if I looked hard here, but I don't know.
That's fine. That's fine.
You're right. I mean, a lot of these people have been understudied. What the other woman, she has a long name, and I'm trying to remember her name. The one that teaches at Ariel. She spent an awful lot of time reading all these Christian missionaries in the Middle East and talking about a variety of groups and essentially studying the Jewish response, which basically is what we said already. Either they ignore, or they banish, or you refuse to talk to these people, and so on. So you're right. Katzin is actually getting into trouble, and I do recall mention the fact that he must have gone Meshuggah to be able to write polemics, because that's not what a Jew should be doing.
Right. I mean, he actually treads a dangerous path. He says, "Yeah, we killed Jesus, but he deserved it," and I'll tell you, let me explain why. I mean, that nobody in a Christian country would obviously write anything like that.
Exactly.
You mentioned that the Jews and Damascus blood libel, that period. It's a very sensitive period, even in Syria, which is a predominantly Muslim country. But
you saw at the end of that chapter, I said I can't really figure him out in the end. I mean, he's so you don't know where he stands exactly, and you just have to appreciate the complexity. But he's another example of these people that are struggling to define themselves and are not easily reduced to one line or one ideology.
Those are the only ones that are fun to write about. I mean, the other ones are boring. These are the people that's where the meat is. But by the way, about Kassan, I couldn't help but I find a striking parallel to a founding myth of the Karaite religion, of the Karaite sect of Judaism. I think it's the Rabbis in Sefer Kabbalah who says that Anan ben David, because he was rejected from the post of exilarch, decided to found his own sub-religion, and he actually reached out to the Muslim and Christian leaders to gain their support and saying, "I'm not like those guys. I reject the Talmud, and therefore, I can be the exilarch," or something along those lines.
Yes, Ibn Hanifa, I think. He mentions actually a sectarian Muslim who he actually, the story, I don't know if it's the Rabbit or it's another one of the early Karaite sources where it talks, but it's a rabbinic source against Karas.
Yes.
It's suggesting that I can found my own sect, and therefore you can't touch me. You know?
Because he was rejected from the post. He was the firstborn. And the rabbis didn't like him because he was an independent thinker. I mean, it's so striking because in the report that the consul writes, that's where we have this information. He says he declares himself a religious reformer. He has denounced the precepts of the Talmud and undertaken to form a new sect of Reformed Jews. To me, it was, and he wrote to the Muslim sheiks and the Christian bishops demanding their support. It's just a fascinating, a little-known episode in Jewish history, which I think has been suppressed because nobody.
Right. Well, of course, should we take the council's word as the final? We don't know, but
so
absolutely. Right. I mean, the way it's framed, I mean, he's essentially agreeing with Mccall. I mean, on some level, which is impossible. He fought against Mccall.
Right. By the way, you did mention that the Mccall and his gang were kind of championing this Torah-only sola scriptura, Weltanschauung, and it's like it almost sounds like you said. Like, I'm wondering, what did they think of Karaites? Did they have any kinder word to say about them? Did you come across anything?
That's a great question, and it's a big question. Actually, the Christian idealization of the Karaites, Protestant idealization of the Karaites, begins as early as the 17th century. There's a very famous article. I don't know if you came across Yosef Kaplan's work.
Yes,
professor at the University on the Conversos.
Yes.
So he has a very famous article about the Karaites of Amsterdam.
Yeah.
In which he talks about how Christians rediscovered the Karaites because they see them as Protestants.
Yes.
They see them, and so they lionize the Karaites.
Yes.
And the Karaites, there is a reality of Karaism, of course, in the 16th, 17th century.
Yes.
Yosef del Medigo and other Jews go to, the Crimean region to meet Karaites and so on. But at the same time, the Karaite is also a myth in his own right. He's a good Jew. He's a biblical Jew.
He's an archetype.
And that's exciting to him. And of course, Reform Judaism also has its own, romance with the Karaites because of its own history of biblical Judaism, so to speak.
Right. You have Wolf Marx in London, who kind of founds this sort of neo-Karaite reform congregation.
Well,
So,
he doesn't call it that, and of course McCall argues that this is halfway on the way to Christianity.
Right.
But of course, the Reformed Jews don't convert, so he gets angry at them because they're not going the whole way. They're still hypocrites, he says.
Right. Mark Shapiro was saying, I don't know if you know him, Professor Mark Shapiro from University of Chicago. He says, I don't know, perhaps, he also had a strong rationalist, anti-Kabbalistic trend among certain rabbis where, that could have been it. It doesn't necessarily, like you say, just because the council wrote it doesn't mean it happened exactly that way. We know little, but there's much more to be researched, I think, on that field. Didn't happen that long ago.
Harel picked up that phrase also, Reform Jews. It could be a way of a Western European conceptualizing what he sees.
Right.
It was obviously a kind of different kind of shul that he created around him. Whether it was actually reform or not, it probably. But you never know. Harel kind of suggests that during his wanderings in Europe, he got a more positive view of reform. But of course, initially in his earlier books, he's very critical of reform too, and sees sees the fall. The rabbis are guilty because they couldn't answer Mccall, and they couldn't answer Reform Judaism properly, and therefore we are in this horrible situation where I, sitting in Aleppo, have to answer them.
Well, let's backtrack for a second and talk about Revel and Rashi Fin, as they were known among Maskilic circus.
Okay, this is going on a long time, but you're okay with it. All right. Okay.
Let me know. Give me the signal.
All right. Well, let's. It's 8:13. Let's finish by 8:30.
Absolutely. Okay. So like you said this before, the Maskilim, and the Maskilim run the gamut. You have more right-wing Maskilim who champion the prevailing, for the most part, but want certain reforms in the pedagogical system and otherwise, and others who are very much to the left and want complete abrogation or something along those lines. Then you have the ones in the middle. So Revel and Rashi would be more, I guess, right of center. Would you cast them? Yeah.
Shmuel Feiner calls them moderate, mitunim. They. But again, they're making a shidduch with the Russian government. They're arguing for governmental reform of Jewish education. It depends, but on the other hand, they come out of that yeshiva tradition. They are deeply embedded in rabbinic Judaism, and they never abandon it. They were still Shomrei Shabbat, and they were so. Indeed, they were somewhere in the center or to the right. But nevertheless, the most famous work of Levinson is Tuda B'Yisrael. I don't know how you translate that. Tuda is some kind of a public letter, a public pronouncement to Israel.
Right.
That is a radical educational statement about the fact that Jews need to reform their entire curriculum and become part of the larger society. It is equivalent very much to calling him like a Mendelssohn in that respect. On the other hand, what a rabbinic scholar this guy was. But on the other hand, notice how I keep adding these reservations because of the complexity. I don't know if you remember when one of the ways he puts down Mccall is saying, you think you know rabbinics, but you don't know rabbinics. And even if you did know rabbinics like a good yeshiva bacher, you don't know Greek, you don't know Latin, you don't know philology, you don't know historical context. You need all those tools to be a rabbinic scholar. In other words, who is he defining? He's not defining a yeshiva bacher. He's defining a new scholar of the university. He's defining the new Wissenschaft des Judentum, the new science of Judaism. And of course, he is the embodiment of that, Levinson.
Right.
And
he's alone in that. The vast majority of Jews in Poland and Russia are nothing like him. He's a tiny minority. right?
Absolutely.
I mean,
and even his contemporary Maskilim were not as educated. I mean, you really, I mean, the guy wrote so many books. His big book is Beit Yehuda, which is an enormous book, where many of the themes that he develops in the books against Mccall are found there. And
by the way,
what a vast
an interesting aside.
Yeah,
an interesting aside. If I can go off on a tangent for a second. He was a familial relation with the Rabbi Israel Friedman, of the founder of the Russian Hasidic dynasty. I don't know if you're aware of this. And he actually had a correspondence with him. This is mentioned in who's the Hasidic historian from Israel? I can't remember his name. The one who wrote about the scandals in the Hasidic circles. Yeah.
David.
Asaf.
What's his name?
Asaf.
Yeah, Asaf,
right.
Of course.
Yeah, so that's an interesting.
Wow, so you read everything.
I try where I can get my hand done.
Do you know Elchanan Reiner also, his work?
The name sounds very familiar. I've probably read some of his works, but I'll put that on my list.
He writes mostly articles. Take a look on academia. And you'll see some really fascinating writing, particularly about the impact of print on halakha. Have
you come across anything in another famous favorite, I should say, Moscow of mine, in Gottlober, or Abag, Alobed Gimel, from Bear Gottlober? Ever heard of him?
Yeah, I've heard of him. I can't say I've read him. I know Yisrael Tal has written something on him, and also Feiner. But they are an extremely interesting group, and they all deserve full monographs.
Right.
So much of Haskalah is about political thought, and I one of the emphasis of this book is a very small contribution, but to see Eastern European Jewish thinking in its own right as being distinct and actually more authentic than what goes on in Germany, where you're dealing with a whole group of thinkers that don't know the Judaism like these guys. I mean, are not,
right.
Balabayit in Chazal.
Right.
So anyway, I'm with him. I wish I could go on and do this, but you need to know more. Know Polish, and you need to know really more about you need to be an Eastern European historian, which I'm not, of
It's
course.
just a pleasure to read the Hebrew writings of these Maskilim, the historical writings. For instance, Gottlober has a whole thing on Karaites. You love to visit them, spend time with them. There's definitely that fascination with other Jews and cultures and everything along those lines. I want to wrap it up. I don't want to take too much of your time. I can't help but get stuck on this passage that you quote from Cheskel Meshuman, or Stanislaus Hoga, who says, for I am sure that the poorest Jewish schoolboy in a wretched village in Poland has a better notion of the supreme being than all the doctors in divinity at Oxford. I love that. I love that. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, here's a guy, right? So here's a guy who's obviously not, set and not happy where he is, and definitely pining for the old life. And there's a lot of beauty in simplicity, and authenticity in simplicity. If I can put those together.
I think that's well said. But as I said to you earlier, some of Mccall's writings, and particularly a book called Sketches of Judaism, he has a chapter on Hasidim there. He has a chapter on the yeshivot in Poland. It almost sounds the same sentiment. In other words, Mccall too is in love with watching these Jews take Judaism so seriously. Of course, he attacks them in the end, but nevertheless, there is a sentiment of appreciation there, which is quite amazing. I mean, you can't miss that as well as his again love-hatred, where they go they're
right.
part of the same thing. But you're right with Cheskel Meshuman. He doesn't. In the end, he doesn't see himself as a Meshuman. He knows fully well that he has done a horrible thing. I don't think he, finds his daughter like that story that Sid Lyman tells and so on, and returns to Judaism fully. There's no evidence of that. But nevertheless, again, he is defining his own Jewish way, and for him, it's legitimate.
And these
I wonder how contemporary Jews are going to react to a book and these strange mixtures of ideology. But that's what's so fascinating about history. It's not so simple.
And it definitely helps or doesn't help depending on what side you're on. That most of them are eyed with suspicion. They're not exactly warmly welcomed. I think it was C.D. Ginsburg, another famous convert. You didn't mention Christian David Ginsburg says about how they were treated. They were put aside. They were given. They weren't treated as equals. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely.
Contempt. There's definitely contempt. Yeah.
You're right, and so I don't know. So converts don't always make it, but I mean, look at the reality of our community today, where when I years ago when I was doing what are called in the trade synagogues. You know what a synagogue is?
No.
A gig in a synagogue.
Oh.
Synagogues.
Love it.
So when you go to a Reform synagogue, you have to be very careful, not only not to say anything negative about Judaism, but not negative about Christianity, because your audience is probably made up of Jews and Christians.
Yeah.
That's the reality of the world that we live in. It's not so much a part of a Haredi world, I know, but the larger Jewish community is a very mixed, complex community, and clearly you can see this kind of thing. Oh, here's the name of Mckall's book, by the way. It's called The Bible, the Talmud, and the New Testament. It's on the back cover of my book.
Yeah.
Elijah Soloveitchik's commentary on the Gospels.
Yes.
Isn't that outrageous?
That is something. I haven't gotten to that one yet, but it's definitely on my list. That is absolutely outrageous.
One other can I give you finally an advertisement of one of my students? Because
absolutely.
Mccall Talmidai is Kelty. My last doctoral student is a woman named Tamara Morsel Eisenberg. Do you know her? Have you come across her name?
No, I've not.
So she finished her doctorate at Penn a couple of years ago. She wrote on print culture and the transformation of the halachic process in early modern Europe. Mm-hmm. She is a very orthodox woman who worked with me, with Roger Chartier, who is one of the great historians of print and material culture, and Elhanan Reiner, who is the great scholar of rabbinic Judaism in the early modern period in Eastern Europe.
Right.
And she worked on Teshuvot and studied the material culture of how these books were originally manuscripts and then eventually became printed, and what happens to the process of halacha through the agency of print. It is a brilliant dissertation. She won one of the great awards for postdoc. She is now a postdoc in the Harvard Society at Harvard, and she is in her second or third year. Just had a child, but she is a brilliant young historian, and I bet your listeners would find her work extremely interesting. If you take a look at Tablet about a couple of weeks ago, you'll see an article about Jews and plagues. She wrote this during the pandemic, or during the beginning of the pandemic. Her name is Tamara Morsel Eisenberg.
Is it allowed to leave the city?
She's married
is
to
she the one? Okay, she wrote that article entitled "Is it allowed to leave the city?" or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Okay, that's yeah, brilliant. Yeah, very well received. Brilliant student.
She's good. I think you'd find her.
I like her.
700-page thesis quite amazing. Anyway, I'm happy to leave you with a student of mine for the Dor Haba.
By the way, I can't help but mention.
For talking with me.
Absolutely.
My book so carefully.
Absolutely, I can't help but mention because you brought up conversos. I'll finish with that. Professor Jose Foer, who just passed away last week.
I knew him very well. I certainly did. We talked a lot about Shevet Yehuda, and we talked about conversos, and I know his books very well, and he was a very interesting personality, to say the least. Did you ever study with him?
No, but I knew many people in his circle. I always regret not having ever studying with him. But No.
You just have a love affair with
absolutely.
Sparty.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have another student who teaches at Princeton named Yaakov Dweck.
Oh, he's great. I loved his book.
Him?
Yeah, I never know him personally, but I love his books. Jacob Sasportas was a great book. His first book was on Dalmodena, was amazing. Absolutely love his book.
I see you've read it all. All right.
I try.
Anyway, he did his doctorate with me as well. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, he's great. He doesn't respond to my emails. I don't know why.
No, he's a snob. I'm not gonna tell you. I try to teach him Derek Harris, but he doesn't like these kind of things to do. But he writes very well, doesn't he?
Great, brilliant. Absolutely. Jam-packed, lots of information, lots of great stuff. Fascinating figures that he picks out, and gives them the thorough treatment. That's what I love. All right.
Tell me your last name. All I know is Yoel.
Yeah, Weisberger is my official name.
That's Ashkenazi Muvak. Yeah.
Oh, Ashkenazi Muvak. But apparently my great-grandfather changed it from Vagoda.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I did a genetic thing on 23andMe, and I'm matched with Abe Vagoda's family. So it looks like I'm related.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah, you ever heard of a Chazan Shmuel Vagoda?
Yeah.
The Chazan Shmuel Vagoda was also a relative of mine. So that's was originally the family name from Poland. That's what it seems like.
And you never studied for smicha or anything?
I never did smicha. I never did an advanced degree. It's my regret, and I'd like to do it one day when I have some peace of mind, if that hopefully happens.
All right. Well, anyway, I hope you got some peace from the last hour.
I loved it. I loved every minute of it. I loved it, and I really, really appreciate it. And I hope you keep on writing, and I can interview again on your next book. If you would write another book, which hopefully you do, any idea what it would be on?
I don't know. I'm actually starting small with a few smaller characters that I left out of my previous books. But you know my book on Jewish Enlightenment in England. But before that, I wrote a book on science and Judaism.
Right.
Which that was before I came to Penn, I was at Yale, and that subject of the interaction between, the two worlds, bringing the two worlds together is really that interchange, that the cultural transfer is what's always been, at the heart of my own work. But besides offering myself again, I can mention a whole bunch of other candidates for this. He just published an interesting book. I don't know if you saw it. What's his name? He's at Gretz College. He published the 10 Shailot or questions of a guy named Eilberg in the 16th century, which is the kind of skeptic of the 16th century. Joseph is his last name. He's actually the grandson of who was the great seminary figure? I'm showing my age. I'm having a senior moment. I can't remember.
Not Ginsburg.
If you want suggestions of younger people to talk to,
Finkelstein? Nothing.
Send me an email. I'll give you some names.
All right. We'll definitely stay in touch by email. I'm looking forward to it. All right.
Okay.
Thank you. And hopefully we'll talk again soon. All the best. Stay safe and
Okay. Cool too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.